Good day, everyone. Welcome. I'm Alan Schimmel, CEO of TechStrong, and you're watching DevOps Unbound. This is a DevOps and Compliance Synergy, Reality or Fiction Roundtable. And we've got a great roundtable of experts to talk to today. Unfortunately, one of our participants is having a bit of an audio problem, and we'll see her come in and out, and hopefully we'll get that fixed. But we will keep working on it, and we'll carry on the best we can in the meantime. Today's show, by the way, I should mention, is sponsored by our friends at Tricentis, as they sponsor all DevOps Unbound, and many thanks to them. I think we have our friends at Perforce on this as well. We have friends from all over. We're going to introduce them all to you here in just a moment. Before I do, though, for those of you who are not familiar with the Big Marker system, it does play right here in your browser. For most of you, on the right-hand side of your browser window, you will see the communications panel. And you can see it has chat, which is probably highlighted there, and then there's QA, polls, handouts. If you got chat as highlighted and you look at chat, you'll see there's different versions of chat, or the different rooms of chat. There's a public chat, which goes to everyone. There's presenters, which we'll use on the back end. Private, if you're doing, you want to talk to someone one-on-one, but please don't harass other attendees. I don't believe I have to say that, but I do. We don't use the Twitter one. Next to chat in the communications panel is Q&A. And if you click on that, you'll see they're very simple to put in here. The reason I'm spending time showing you all this is a live roundtable. We have an abstract, we have an agenda, we have subjects we want to cover. But by and large, if this works right, this discussion will be driven by you, our audience. We want you to be part of this. Ask your questions, give us your comments. You can put it into chat and everyone can chime into it. You could put it into the Q&A section, and I will ask our panel to comment on it, and you'll be able in chat to comment further on that. This, I'm telling you right now, this roundtable is as good as you guys make it, right? And I always like to start off by saying, hey, check into our chat. Let us know you're here and where you're from. But I guess we've had people who are, Mitchell asked it already in chat. That's why. Because I was going to say, everyone's telling us where they're from. But thank you. Thank you for coming. Feel free to let us know where you're from. It's always, even after being on the internet for 25 years, I still get a kick out of seeing people from near and far, joining in with us here. So thank you. Today's DevOps Unbound, as I mentioned, is about DevOps and Compliance Synergy, Reality or Fiction. I think we're going to have a lively discussion around it. Let me introduce you to our audience. First, I'd like to introduce Tracy Bannon. Depending on you, everybody has a different configuration, so I can't tell you where she is on your window. But Tracy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey guys, I go by Trace, so I just dropped that Y. I'm Trace Bannon.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's like Bob or Robert. No one's gonna get angry. So real quick, because we want to get into the meat of today's conversation, I'm a senior principal with the MITRE Corporation. My background is a software architect. I'm also an engineer, and I do a lot of DevOps advising as part of our Advanced Software Innovation Lab. I spend a lot of time solving complex problems with software, and that's what I do. Most of my clients are the U.S. government, although I deal with partner nations and U.S. allies. So I spend a lot of time there. I do a lot of working with industry to help merge the needs together to get everything out in the open. For folks who are not aware, MITRE is a federally funded research and development corporation chartered by Congress so that the government has an objective voice, because I'm not selling anything. I'm here to give, to drive them forward and give them that advice. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you. Um, Josh Weiss, hello and welcome to Perforce, man. Nice to see you out there. Chase, thank you. And yet, you know what MITRE is? It's sort of that quasi-governmental thing where it has its freedom, has one foot in the private sector, one foot in public sector. And look, I'm not here to toot their horn or anything, but they've done so much work over the years. Mitchell and I have worked with folks from MITRE for 25 plus years, right? Whether we're talking about CVEs and that whole system, or I mean, they're involved in so many different aspects of this.
Great organization.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.
Next up, I want to introduce, I believe he's coming to us from UK today, Steve Howard. Hey, Steve, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Alan. Yes, indeed, from the UK. So hopefully all of these wires under the ocean keep working and I can keep talking to you, but so far so good. So yeah, I work for Perforce based out of Minnesota there in the US. And Perforce makes DevOps tools. That's what we do at Perforce. We help engineers get the best out of those tools to really realize their goals with DevOps and within DevOps. My specific area within Perforce is in the static analysis tools business, SaaS tools, if you want to call it that as well. We have two products, Perforce, Clockwork and Helix QAC. And a lot of our customers are in those mission critical, safety or security critical industries across the globe. So that's what we do. And my role within that team is looking after our pre-sales engineering group across the rest of world territory. So anything outside of North America, actually. Yeah, so that's my primary focus. And as I say, our customers are in those kinds of safety or security critical industries. So we get to see a lot of interesting systems and help them to produce hopefully more secure, more reliable systems at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Steve, thanks. And thanks for joining us. Our next panelist really needs no introduction to any TechStrong audience. She's been with us almost like I don't know if she's somehow on the payroll or what, but our good friend Rosalind Radcliffe. And for those of you who know Rosalind, actually Rosalind's going to share some news with us today about her own personal career. Rosalind, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm still with IBM and I am an IBM Distinguished Engineer. And for those of you who know me, I've been working in the DevOps space to help our large enterprises transform, including IBM Z. So anybody who knows me knows I'm around Z, and that part is never going to change, I think, since I started in ISPF development 34 years ago. But I did take a new role in IBM, and I'm now working in the CIO's office responsible for DevSecOps as the CTO. So I get to help transform our internal practices to be the hybrid cloud showcase that it can be. And yes, we run our systems on mainframe. Of course we do. We have IBM Z and everything else, of course. And so I get to do it for IBM now, not just for clients. So it should be fun. And it official like yesterday. So it's a new role.
Well, congratulations, Rosalind.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Congrats.
They're lucky to have you in there, Rosalind. And you know, we should mention chops around security and compliance and so forth. Rosalind has a new book out. If you want to hold it up, actually published by Accelerated Strategies Press. Mitchell has his copy here, and it's called Enterprise Bug Busting. And we are really proud of it. And I think you all should go out and rush
an
and
amazing
grab a
book.
copy on Amazon. Perfect timing. Our final, well, besides Mitchell's co-host, our final member today, and I'm praying that this audio works, is Sonia Lawrence. Sonia, does it work?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Oh!
Last minute. Hello.
What the folks dialed in don't know is that we've been chatting for a half an hour and we've been watching Sonia pop in and go away and pop in and go away, trying to get the audio fixed. Congrats.
You know what, man?
Yay.
What a trooper. Once that curtain goes up, boom.
Ready?
Sonia, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. Thanks for having me on. And I am the Senior Global Compliance Manager, Product Manager here at Tricentis. I actually just joined. And I am super excited about this discussion. Here at this role, I'm actually helping multiple product teams come up to speed with targets on what compliance frameworks they want to apply. Of course, that applies to privacy and security. And I so wanted to talk as we were getting warmed up for this conversation, because I definitely am compassionate about the DevOps position, the dev position, about how to apply all of these various security requirements, do it in a way that your customers can trust, and that you can build that framework effectively and in a lean fashion internally. So it's one I'm living, and I love being more on the strategic side. So I do believe that planning well leads to compliance that works and leads to security. So that's my space.
Thank you. And thank you for joining with us today.
Yeah.
Oh, that worked out perfectly. Next and last, or not least, though, bringing up the caboose here, Mitch Ashley. Mitchell, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Alan. And Mitch Ashley, I'm CTO with TechStrong Group, and also I'm principal for research at TechStrong Research, which is formerly Accelerated Strategies Group. So I'm so happy for Rosalind getting your book out. Man, it's been a journey we've been on together, and it was just so fantastic to get her knowledge captured into a fantastic book. So please check it out. I'd encourage everybody to do that. So thanks, Al. Good to be here. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Mitchell. Yes. So again, for those maybe who came a little later, this is an open roundtable. It's open to you, our audience. Use chat. Tell us where you're from. Ask any questions. Talk to each other. Q&A goes to our panel, and we could ask questions from there. And please take advantage of it. So I wanted to kick things off. As Trace mentioned, we spent a half hour just kind of in the green room talking a bit today. And Trace made a point about something that to me has been not the bane of many security people's existence, but something that we've seen as a problem, right? And that is the security does not equal compliance, and compliance does not equal, right? So it's the equal sign with that slash through it. You know what I'm talking about?
The little Ghostbusters thing, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. Does not equal. And I think for some of us, or for some in the security industry, we forget that every once in a while, or we got hung up in compliance as being we don't have to worry about security because we're compliant kind of thing. And I know, Trace, you mentioned this was a particular kind of spur in your saddle?
Be in my bonnet? I don't know.
Something
Wait, is that
like
sexist?
that.
I don't know. Thorn on my side.
Okay, good. We'll go with that. It could go either way. I'm with you.
So
tell us about it, though. Why don't you kick it off?
It's very similar to a lot of discussions that we're having right now. We don't agree on what the taxonomy is. We don't agree on what the definition of a word is. So we glom onto something because we notice that somebody else has a success. So instead of thinking about it, we just hop onto it. Compliance and security are the same thing. We design in security. We model for threats. We build to have secure, and then we check. Compliance is about validating that we've got the controls in place, but it's not about the developers create compliant code. Our infrastructure folks help us to apply appropriate controls. Compliance is about checking that we did what we said we were going to do and identifying where there are gaps or there are changes. So it's kind of really, they are two different things, the thought up front and then the validation and verification and the watchfulness that goes on. That's why the DevSecOps pipeline is such a great place for compliance, right? I'm not going to be able to automate in security. I can't depend on the pipeline to give me my security, but it sure as heck can check on what's going on. And I think that's where, Steve's got a lot of different tools in his quiver. Is that arrows in the quiver? That help us to do that. But it is that definition, and folks fight about that. Oh, I've got a compliance team. Oh, I've gone through this compliance process, therefore my stuff is secure. Right up into the point where they have a massive breach. It's like, you were only checking for these things, peeps. Yeah. Did you actually track back, how secure you were from the beginning? So thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about that a little bit, Alan.
No problem.
My
Thoughts on
venting,
that?
my ranting on that.
No, I thought
Well,
it's a good jumping off. Go ahead.
And it's a really important point. I mean, I just finished my security and privacy by design training that we have to do every year. So the point is, when we think about this, I have to do it in the first place. I have to think about what is security, what is privacy, how do I deal with this, and I have to design for it.
Correct.
And I absolutely need a pipeline that checks to make sure that those things are there. I absolutely, and I actually have to say I'm going to spend a lot of time making that pipeline a pipeline rather than a spreadsheet, but that's a different discussion because it should be enforced in a pipeline.
Exactly.
There's not everything you can do in a pipeline because it is by design. And so there are things you have to think about, as part of the process. But the pipeline can do a lot of that checking to verify, but it's the same as you actually don't build quality by testing. You build quality and then you verify it. And we have to think about these things. The people in the front are the ones that we need to understand security, understand privacy, understand all these things. And then the compliance to that gets verified in automation. And I think we need to consider that in all spaces, because it is the thought process that ensures we end up with good code or good systems or a good solution that doesn't have an exposure in it. Because the first time I write code, there's not going to be a check.
Well, but you bring up a really good point that we need to, as leaders in this space, helping teams to think about and to implement. The faster that I can give feedback to the very folks who are creating the code, who are designing, who are architecting, I'll say architecting, it's not a bad word, who are architecting up front, the more rapidly that I can give them those feedbacks that have been codified, the faster that they can address them, right? This gets us into the heart of DevOps, small changes, small batches, right? Early commits, frequent commits, to be able to do exactly what you're saying. But there's that pipeline has to be properly tooled to check for those things. So the pipeline doesn't get built later on. The pipeline is getting amplified. It's getting tailored as I'm doing my design work up front. I mean, those two things, I'm not going to build the design for a car and then come back and say, how am I going to actually manufacture this car? I'm going to be thinking about those in parallel, right?
What we do a lot with the tooling side of things in static analysis is around coding standards, for example. So coding standards is a way to capture expertise, I guess, in the barest form of what makes more secure or more safe, depending on what you're actually looking to be compliant to, code, and then trying to enforce that the code we're writing in those small steps and very early in that pipeline, as you mentioned there, Trace, are getting checked for. So are we getting violations of things like that? So are there coding standards and so on that you would recommend as a natural sort of basis to start in the coding, or are we talking more than just that as well? I mean, obviously there are plenty of coding standards out there, like the OWASPs and the certs and the CWEs. What else on top of that from an architectural perspective?
Gosh, so this will be an entire 5-hour conversation if we go down into the there are many, many different standards. I think where Rosalind would probably table pound on this is that you have to be intentional about picking your standards, knowing what's relevant to your industry, to your, if government is going to be different, and there can be policies, there are laws, there are internal, there are client contractual things. So you have to be aware. Security, Brian Finster and I joke about this all the time. Security is a quality attribute. So it's quality. So it's something that should be tested for and designed in from the very beginning. Sometimes we tend to think about it as something magical and mythical and different. No. If I'm not designing in security from the beginning, and if I'm not helping the developers to understand that from the beginning, it's no different than if I didn't help them to understand the rest of the domain space, how somebody needs to interact with the screen or what the process is to order something from this new store they're building. So it's, a bigger part of this, and Steve, your tools really help the developers with this, is that we're asking the developers to do more. And when I say developers, I don't just mean coders. I mean, you are talking about all the people who are doing the initial kickstarting aspect that goes into that pipeline. Educating them, because we're putting so much onto their shoulders. They've become hobbyists, and not because they're not competent and capable, because well, I was trained to do X. Now I need to learn to do Y and Z. How are you going to help me to do that? And some of the different tools help me to be able to do that, help my developers to be able to understand that much more quickly.
Yeah.
I want to jump in because Josh, one of our attendees, put in the Q&A section here something that I think Steve and Chase hit on, and that is, call it the alphabet soup of compliance. Mm-hmm. It's very hard. It's very hard, especially if you're not like deeply immersed in the world of compliance and security, to understand what compliance standard should this code or this app be concerned about. When GDPR first came out, was like, well, we don't really have any customers in Europe. We don't have to worry about it. Nonsense. The world's too small today, right? If you've got an app out there, GDPR is important to you. Well, we don't take credit cards. I don't worry about PCI. Or, I'm not in California, right? California has their own things. Sonia, we haven't heard from you. Building tests for this. What do you do? Is there a checkbox? I want to check this standard, that standard, and that standard.
No, it's actually, I draw a lot from my starting in my career, which was in heavily regulated environments. So I started with FDA medical device development. And in that space, you have to walk in the door, not just knowing what your customer requirements are. Quality is obviously inherent because you have people's lives at risk. And so in that world, you have to know from the get-go, what are my targets, right? How am I going to prove I'm clean? I have a product that won't harm anyone. My software is reliable and it's actually producing the calculations required to sustain life. So in that world, design control development is the backbone of all development. And since I started in that space, it's been fascinating to me. I've worked with PCI. I've worked with many of these other alphabet soups of compliance frameworks that we have to meet. And I'll have to tell you, like for me, I think there's actually kind of a balance of both knowing your requirements and a lot of creativity, because I can walk in the door and say, as a developer team, you need to make sure you hit OWASP. Your infrastructure needs to be SIS compliant. Now, they're probably still not going to know what exact, code to write. But if I have the right tools supporting that, I can make that translation real time. So for me, I see it truly as a product quality. I love that item of it's a cradle to grave. You think of it at the beginning and you think of it at the end too. And you have to monitor it along the way to make sure you're staying true to those targets. And I think one of the things specific to the SaaS space, and even for now, I think infrastructure needs to become more and more hardened with what we're seeing in the space. It's really important that you know how to code that in and test it and understand what those common threats are going to be, and just make sure that those developers and DevOps teams feel supported. So you can basically translate almost real time some days to make they are compliant and secure kind of at the same time. I really don't see them as two different deliverables, because in the moment of a breach, I feel like the first question is, how did we miss it, right? What did we not do, right? And so I've definitely sat in that seat.
Well, there's
Sonia, what that makes me think of is TechStrong Research is doing quite a bit of work in this GRC area, and it's interesting that we're having this conversation, right? Did we have the compliance conversation as a software organization 5 or 10 years ago? It was more of a necessary evil. Now everybody's brought it to the table, and we're working on it together about how we elevate that in our process. But I think one of the drivers behind it, and you were kind of hinting at this, Sonia, is that the regulatory landscape is not only broad and international, and there's a lot of regulation. Their response to the advancement of those regulations and technology is also becoming quicker and more sophisticated. So it doesn't just kind of leave it out there for 30 years and you're still trying to make
it's not static.
It's a very dynamic world, and if you think that's a perfect fit for why we do DevOps, for speed of software, which can also be for adaptability of compliance, but that also brings in automation, right? You can't do it all manually anymore.
Yeah, and I feel like GDPR and CCPA, like the two most, to me, most broad-reaching, new compliance points that most companies now have to meet. It's a very broad, like almost an electronic person, if you will. You have to respect all of that data around a human being. Once that happened, everyone became regulated. And so now it's not just a question of, are we regulated? The first answer is likely you are. And now here's the set of laws you have to comply to. And then you walk through that translation of, well, what is secure enough? And that's where you start to translate. And I feel like that space right there, I try to encourage our dev and DevOps teams, like there is a lot of creativity in that moment. You can go look at tools that you think fit you well. We can walk into the audit with multiple different types of, proof. It's really, what do we need to support? What are you comfortable with? What is the right amount of security to be put in place? And just like with any, security assessment from outside in, when we have a new customer looking at us, I always remind people too, like there is no way you can ever state you won't have an incident, you won't have a breach. It's how do you recover from it from that point on? So
Response.
Yeah.
You guys all bring up a really fantastic point that in the past, compliance has been checklist, right? Similar to how we do a deployment. It was a checklist. It was a really long checklist. It took us from Friday night until Sunday morning. Don't get me started. That's what got me into DevOps in the first place, is that I like sleep. But the pace of change, compliance needs to change frequently as well. So it's not that the DevOps pipeline is not the thing that will save us. What will save us is constantly and chronically having our finger on the pulse and being able to react. So DevOps pipeline, DevOps principles, evolutionary architecture, having very decoupled architectures and the ability to rapidly evolve when a change happens. Those are all things that have to play a part in this. It's not any one thing. I can't just buy that tool, implement it, and I'm going to be great. I'll be great for this little window until that bad guy over there figures out a way to thwart it, right? And so we have to be able to, in the same way that we want to get software out the door at speed of relevance, we have to be able to react to cyber threats in the software and then be auditing the bejesus out of it, checking for the existence, whether or not we've addressed it, constantly and chronically.
Sorry.
It's a continuous improvement process and a continuous transformation process of all aspects. We have to consider continuous improvement for compliance, for security, for all of those things as part of the process. And if I'm always looking at the process to make it, what can I do to make it easier, faster, development teams be able to be more efficient and find more of the problems, the better off we are. What tools will help them? And we also have to be careful, though, in this space. A bunch of tools, finding a bunch of vulnerabilities that aren't real doesn't help either. Please, it doesn't help to tell me that this is a vulnerability when it's not. So you also have to look at what matters to you, what you're writing, and you have to deal with places where there aren't, I'll admit it, COBOL. There aren't a lot of security vulnerability scanners for COBOL. In fact, I might say there really aren't any real good ones because it's different. Now, I might say that COBOL's safer. I'm going to say that word. Nothing's ever safer. Because in general, it was written in a different time. And in general, those developers had a set of policies that we had to follow or we couldn't. So there were a set of things done. That isn't true anymore. We have new people coming in doing COBOL. So we have to consider all the aspects of all of the languages, and nothing's excluded. Everything needs to be included. That infrastructure as code that you just wrote better have the same security checks on it, or something to make sure you don't slip in an infrastructure change that you didn't intend. All of it has to be continuously improved and looked at.
You bring up a word. You didn't say the word, but it comes to mind here. Context. You got to understand your context. There was a question in the Q&A chat was, which standard do I follow? Got to understand your context. And Rosalind, you bring up, got to know your languages, got to know your tech stacks. They're going to be different types of vulnerabilities based on who your client is. if you're putting something out, if you're eBay and putting something mass out, and there's a different set of vulnerabilities there that if I'm writing embedded software or if I'm deploying something onto a ship, I do a lot with the Department of Defense. All depends on your context and the architectures that are there. I mean, it's not insurmountable. It just takes being thoughtful. It just, and I use just, it just takes, take a step back and be thoughtful about it. Context.
I might not put the word just in front of that, but yes, it takes context and it takes that looking at where you are, what you're going to be. And, you know, if your machine is totally isolated, I mean, it has no connectivity to anything, then it has a different set of requirements. Though I'm not sure what machines sit in that world other than maybe on a ship. High
side intel. There are definitely places where there's isolation, but the point is still the same. And you're right. I've actually eradicated the word just from my lexicon in general. It is about being intentional, not rushing towards a tool for the sake of a tool. No tool alone is going to save you. No tool alone is going to save you. Steve, I'm sure will be the first person. Steve to my left right now.
Completely.
The first person to tell me that. But DM, excuse me, can I say that? It will absolutely 100% help me if I'm intentional about how I'm going to apply it, about what am I trying to accomplish. It doesn't need to be a science fair project every time. You got to start somewhere. Fast feedback, upskilling, the education that has to happen, but knowing what standards apply to you, knowing what policies apply to you, and knowing what those challenges are for your context is going to be that starting point, right?
Well, and so we're actually at this inflection point right now, both at Tricentis and at my former company. And I feel like in the marketplace for these tools that we're referring to that both help improve security, privacy as well, there's quite a few of them coming on the market. One of the first things I look for is, does it integrate well and seamlessly back into the developer's tool of choice? You know, if it's Jira or something else, some of the other standards. And what I've seen is once you've got that tool running, you're doing your scans, and then they start to understand, what does it mean if I have the OWASP top 10? You know, this tool is telling me I have 5 of these events and across my code. I feel like there's also just that inherent training. So the tools become, to me, so much a part of the answer, because the more they're integrated, the more it's easy for the developers to just see very quickly, these are the recommendations on how to fix it. I need to be SIS compliant. Here's my, potentially 50 to 100 issues and I need to fix in my infrastructure. Once that transition has occurred, ideally with a tool that's automated, they also learn how to apply that across other code changes or other infrastructure implementations. So I feel like the thing that's really shifting right now is those tools are also becoming compliance aware. There's quite a few of them that now also spit out these beautiful reports that say, look, you have no issues from the SIS standard for your AWS instance. And it's been fascinating to see how long it's taken some of these development support tools to respond to these market needs, but I feel like it's becoming much more standard and expected walking in the door. But still, the backbone to me is that automation directly to the developer or the DevOps teams.
So here's a question for you. It popped into my mind as you were talking about this. Yeah. The more that I give a developer another tool, at what point do I need to have somebody who's slightly more experienced? Because I've got a lot of folks who are newer in their career and they are amazing and they are insightful. But I started to think about, well, that's great, but do they understand what they're reading? Do they understand the impacts of these things? So I think we're also going to see a need to continue to upskill. I mean, there's a reason that we have a Rosalind, right? There's a reason that we've got Mitch. There's a reason that we've got, some of the folks like Mark Peters is on today. I see him in the chat. There's a reason that we have those folks who are a little more, a little further along in their career to be able to say, okay, this is why this one matters. This other thing is a little bit of noise. Here's why it's noise in your context.
Right. I think it's absolutely imperative. And I also think alongside people who have that seniority to help people understand and learn as they go, right? A lot of these, it's a high volume of information that people need to start ingesting to have that seasoning. I think supporting it through awareness and training will always help. Helping them to prioritize like just basic good program management, also something that I have in my background, to clear out that noise will also help support these efforts. And then I think intrinsically, one of my first assessments of an organization is are these approaches and awarenesses intrinsic to the culture? And if I see a dev culture who every time you walk in the door and say, I have a vulnerability list I need you to fix, and you see that, oh no, that's not me, that's a shift in the entire leadership structure too.
Right.
So it can take different avenues with the people awareness side of it as well.
Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's coming up, and you've probably seen some of these tools, Sonia. Mm-hmm. There are AI tools that are helping us to actually point at the outcomes of this, that are actually helping us understand that trend to say, well, I need more developer education over here, or this is not a vulnerability. So you're able to, there's a tool that I can't remember the name of. I was just meeting with a fellow by the name of Muan, and it's a fantastic new tool, but it helps to cut down on the noise. It doesn't get rid of the results. But it says, hey, developer, take a look at these first. These are more likely to be where your challenges are. Yes, there are 1,400 things in this list, but of those, how many are actually high vulnerabilities? So there's some smart stuff that's going to happen in the very near future with AI and ML.
Yeah, there's a lot of research going into this in terms of that processing of results and trying to really prioritize according to the context, which I think is what you said there, Trace, earlier on. It's about the context of, and there's even the idea that you can get feedback from the kinds of issues that other members of the team are actually looking at and fixing, and of course then feed that back into that process as well. So it's learning from that. So there's a whole load we can do there. And the other point I think Sonia made as well around that was the training piece. If we can also, at the point of finding issues and finding problems and security vulnerabilities and so on, if we can actually link that out to knowledge. So obviously it's not scalable to have, a Rosalind on every team. We can't do that. That's just never going to be practical. So how do we get around that? Well, you have things like the CWE guidance and so on, where people have actually documented the kinds of problems, why it's a problem and how it's a problem. And if we can link to that from the point of actually finding vulnerabilities for the developers as they're developing, that's a great start. It really helps to bring that knowledge to them as quickly as possible, I think, in context again.
Yeah, the attack framework. Oh, go ahead, Mitch.
Oh, thanks, Trace. It was great about this conversation. The audience is, many of the folks there are just as knowledgeable about this as we are in many respects. And Tim Johnson, who's in the audience, asked that question. I think it's really fascinating. The whole shift left, let's give developers things to do it early in the process, is sort of very much an overloaded idea. They can't do everything and they're not experts at everything. You can't just turn on the OWASP top 10 of compliance requirements in your tool, right? So who is responsible for translating this changing landscape of compliance into what we're talking about automating into the pipeline, into the workflow? That's still, to me, very much an open question. How does that work, and how do organizations do that? That's a huge challenge.
I think the trend lately has been to combine at many places, at least at many SaaS organizations, common in the California area, is to do the DevSecOps model. I think that it works to a point. I have to say though, like my opinion of that approach is it's only effective as much as your team is ready to take on that volume or potential backlog of issues that they may have. I've also seen like there's a true SecOps group that would form kind of in support of DevOps. I feel like expecting the DevOps team to own all of this again, it's a lot to ask. So I think it's healthier too to have that security ops team sitting, side by side, maybe the DevOps teams, to help kind of augment, help to prioritize and do that assessment. So yeah, I definitely have a lot of opinions in this space because there is a lot to translate to being truly secure. And OWASP top 10 looks simple, but when you start running those scans of an application that's 10 years old, you would be surprised, right? What you find. And
but of the OWASP thing, Sonia, if you look at the OWASP list and how it's changed over time, what's really depressing is that it isn't as though that top 10 is dramatically different. So
that's what I'm saying. It really hasn't changed. No, look, to be fair, this last version did have some changes.
It had some changes. No, and I'm not a hater.
That's the first one that they've had in some time. Hey guys, we're talking here 40 minutes. I want to bring it back right to the title. DevOps and compliance synergy, reality or fiction, right? Trace, you said something early on. Hey, that's why I got into DevOps. You know what? Surprise. It's why I got into DevOps too. I thought it was going to be fantastic for security.
Well, but I
I don't
didn't
know
get
about
into
compliance.
DevOps to do DevOps.
No, either
it's
did
not
I.
my
What
goal.
do I
need to
look like?
deliver software. I
That's
need
the
to
point.
solve
Yeah.
problems. It's
No,
just
but I thought we'd make more secure software by doing DevOps, right?
Yeah.
So, reality or fiction, guys? Let's put it on the line. Has DevOps, well, let's just talk about compliance right now. Has DevOps allowed us to make at least software that maybe is more compliant, if not more secure?
And you're only as good as the team that's putting it together. The question that Mitch asked earlier is whose responsibility is it? So I don't, as I'm an architect, right? I don't delegate it to the developer who's just starting up. I don't hand him a set of requirements and say, okay, you solve these problems. I drew some boxes and some lines and I sold it to somebody. Now you go do it. So whose responsibility is it? There's a shared responsibility, but ultimately you have a lead architect or you have a lead engineer. You have somebody who has a cyber responsibility, who is actually defining as a group, right? This is not a dictatorial own somebody in an ivory tower, but there does need to be somebody who's specifically asked to focus on that and then working with the teams. So it doesn't become people fighting against each other, but understanding and being more specialized to be able to answer those questions. And Alan, to your question, has DevOps resulted in that? I think we need to do some more research. I think it depends, because I would actually say a lot of industry has not done DevOps really well yet. Startups, greenfield, that's great. But all of the other software, the gazillions of lines of software, Rosalind's probably going to shake her head. Yeah, well, that's a different story. And we have refactoring and replacement and modernization that's going on. So we will be as secure as we intend to be, because we are focusing on it and leveraging these smart things like pipelines that have compliance checkers in them that help us to do it. So there, rant over. I'm coming down off my soapbox now.
So I want to say that in some of those really large enterprises that have a lot of that really large code that have been doing this transformation now for, depending on whether or not I want to look at the ones that are 10 years old or the ones that are 3 years old or 2 years old, whatever, they're at various stages. So I think there's a lot more transformation in that legacy world than people might think. Absolutely. I can, the statistics actually show that there's a lot of parts of the organization, and the fortunate thing or the unfortunate thing is some of the larger teams were left out in the beginning. So when the DevOps processes were put in, they weren't included. So I have at least one client who said that when they did the mainframe DevOps pipeline, which, okay, it is the same. So before you say it's totally different, it is relatively consistent.
The principles are the same. Yes.
And the tools actually were the same, except they did DevOps Day 2, as they put it. They made it easier to put compliance checks in. They did things in a way that when new security things showed up, the Z side could implement it actually faster than the distributed side. And it was really nice to see. So it depends. It's an it depends answer. But I would say I think DevOps has really helped in automating compliance for teams to make it easier when people do it right. I mean, there are lots of, you can do it totally wrong. But when you're doing it right, I think it has helped. I think they go together really well if you are thinking in the right way.
Yeah. Rosalind, if I can piggyback on that, we actually, as I mentioned, we're doing a fair bit of research in this area, and we have a report that we're writing right now. But I can kind of preview a few things out of it. I think we've hit this tipping point where people who in heavily regulated industries, like we're looking at finance and healthcare and insurance and things, federal government, things like that. They have seen some benefits already of just getting access to the data, doing some automation and things like that that are in DevOps pipelines. So to your point about there are organizations who have made some progress. In our data, it was roughly under a quarter of people that responded that way in the finance industry. Not too surprising, but what there is a lot of data that points to both some successes, but also a lot of optimism, like over 80% of people saying in the next 3 years in my roadmap, I'm counting on and I'm building plans and executing on those to get more value for my compliance processes through this entire DevOps exercise or process, if you will. So there is data emerging that says, it's not panacea, it's not all solved, but people are starting to rally around this idea and starting to do things and see some results.
Well, and I would have to second everything you guys have said, because I think at the heart of it, it's good design up front. And I will say that one of the challenges at smaller companies really is, do we have that senior dev? Do we have that senior architect or architect with enough experience to help direct these designs up front? If that box is checked, what I've seen is those organizations tend to be much more compliant from the get-go, right? Because they've got that person at the helm helping these development teams understand those real challenges they're going to walk into, irrespective if they're on-prem, traditional infrastructure or in the cloud. And I have to say, it's funny, like as AI has come into the picture, like one of the tools I use, and I actually am looking at again, is Lacework. It is doing some of that real-time analysis for us. It's giving us intelligence even in a breach that we would need in that situation. And I would extend, AI is coming. And in this space, there's so much data to handle. I actually volunteer. I'm like, please hurry it up, get it here faster. Like no human being, because compliance seems to be frank too, tend to be small, right? This isn't the group that has 10 to 15 people traditionally sitting within most, average size organizations. So the volume of analysis too is crippling sometimes. And I feel like the only reason to me why compliance seems like a checkbox and not an active part of the development process is because there's just so much to put into that analysis point. It's like stopping an electron. I'm a chemist actually by trade. So for me, like if you stop an electron and measure it, you don't know where it went, right? And that's the challenge of compliance, is to do that real time.
Yep. Your comment about Laceworks and that there's so much data, it's actually an issue that we're going to continue to see, is that cognitive load on the entire team, on everybody that's associated, business and tech. This is not either one side or the other. The mass of information coming at us, and we're going to become more dependent, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, on leveraging some of these smart tools to help us, again, I'll say, cut through the noise.
Assuming they're smart.
Well, assuming that they are, but the models need to be trained. Somebody needs to train them. But there are some pretty smart tools that are emerging to help us with this, right? To help us cut down on the noise. Doesn't get rid of all of that data collection, but it does help us to pinpoint where we need to be to focusing, because it is overwhelming. It is massively overwhelming. And I imagine that if you are a cyber pro, if that's the thing that you're doing, if you're a compliance guy, gal, or if you are looking at all of that information, imagine how you have to troll through that if you don't have all of these various tools to aggregate and to really get down into the bowels of it.
Absolutely. Hey guys, I need to just take a time out here for a moment, if it's okay. I think I mentioned in the beginning, we do give out 4 Amazon gift cards at all of these roundtables, and we're coming up on 10 minutes to the hour. We'll be wrapping up. I want to announce the winners of the Amazon gift cards today. We have Mark P, Wendy, I think it's Wendy O, Julie H, and Rami R. Our back-end engineers will be reaching out to those folks, and we'll get you out your Amazon gift cards. Thanks for attending today, and hope you buy good stuff on Amazon with them. All right.
They should buy Rosalind's new book.
Look
what I just did there.
Hey, I think Jay should get a little commission on that, man. But anyway, back to it. Steve, we haven't heard from you in a while. What are you thinking?
Well, going back to your original point, DevOps and compliance synergy, my opinion is very much yes. Whether, and I think Trace makes a really valid point, whether the compliance is actually bringing value, that's a whole bigger discussion. We definitely need to make sure we've got that intelligence and the planning up front to ensure that there is value coming out the back end of that pipeline. But that's the truth with any pipeline we set up. If we want to get something sensible out the end, we need to know that we put something in that's going to give us what we want from the planning point of view. But yes, certainly from the automation of actually producing the compliance data, I think we're in a place now which is far better than we were. I come from a similar industry background to Sonia. Mine wasn't medical devices, but it was actually aerospace and aviation. And it's the same thing in that industry. You have it drilled into you from day one that people will die if things go wrong. So you have that mindset, that compliance to making sure we've proven we've done everything that we should have done, and documenting, of course, first of all, what we should be doing is sensible. But it's kind of inherent in those industries. But what I think DevOps has brought to the wider software development team, certainly across embedded systems, which again is where I tend to work these days, is it brought a lot more of that discipline to a wider audience and a lot more control and a lot more visibility. So yeah, from that perspective, I think it's definitely a reality that those two have been well matched. But yeah, completely agree with Trace and Rosalind from the original points they made. And if we don't put anything sensible in that requirement, we end up with something that's fairly pointless. So.
Well, a question for Sonia and Steve, given your backgrounds, do you see the trend, the movement towards DevSecOps as helping with embedded systems, right? When we're talking about there's metal in the mix, right? There's hardware in the mix. Do you see that as helping to move that to make that faster as well? So improvements being made in those medical devices, because you're right. I work primarily on the defense side right now, Steve, and I got to tell you that zero risk, zero tolerance also means that there's a culture that you will have no defects. And so I'm wondering how some of these tools can help create an innovation mindset so that you can learn quickly before something gets out there that hurts somebody, before that happens. Like, I'd be interested in your opinions on that.
Oh, I have a lot of opinions on this space. Having been in that space for 10 years before I transitioned more into development and mobile applications, and now here with the SaaS offering, it's an environment that moves slower inherently because of that very low risk tolerance. But I think part of that challenge is because when we look at those, the Amazon environment, Azure, any of those cloud offerings, I feel like there's always a reluctance of those offerings to answer very clearly, oh, you have to have absolute, design control. You have to know what's in your tech stack, even down to the drivers sometimes. I'll give that to you. And I honestly feel like it's missing in the market, because if those providers had been aware of the basic need, that risk aversion, there probably would already be an automated tool to provide it. And it's just fascinating to me that because moving to the cloud does open risk like that, I have actively traced down an issue with one of the time drivers on a server being incorrect and causing issues in a trial. It took me 2 weeks to find it. And so when those things come out, I'm like, oh my goodness, if we just knew what those changes were and could at least control for it, then that door to innovation, I think, would open to those industries. But because the answer that's needed to that compliance requirement has been lacking, I feel like that industry rightfully has to stand back and go, I'm going to wait until this is really secure, very formally developed, and very solid before we step into that space. And it's starting to happen. But again, I was in that space and I did have to trace down that weird minor issue. So I think it's a real challenge, but the better our tools get, this is why, again, I will come back and say every time, the more we can automate, the more we can predict in that very large, complex, cloud environment, the more likely we are to see that innovation start to occur faster.
And surely the principles of very small repeat, changes in small chunks, so we can actually isolate much quicker, would have helped you with that case, Sonia.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
Agreed.
I hope that we get there.
I mean, I can also bring in the firmware discussion. When you think about firmware, I mean, that's got to be right too. Firmware is the same way. And I know we transition to DevOps pipelines, DevSecOps pipelines, paying attention to security in our firmware work, because it does help. And honestly, it helps for lots of reasons. One, it helps people be more excited. It helps people be more working with things that they're familiar with rather than maybe things that they didn't learn in school. So there is lots of value in that space too. But the through automation and using the principles. Now, is it exactly the same pipeline? No. But are they doing a set of things to allow them to fail fast with firmware? Absolutely. You need to get that same speed. You need that fast feedback, and those small changes, same principles. So I think most things are going to fall into this category of it'll be better if we can help people automate those things that they shouldn't have to do and use their brain power for the parts that are valuable. And the more we can put AI in the pipeline, the better off we all are. But it's still going to take some time.
All right, I'm going to queue up a conversation for another day. This would be a wonderful segue into talking about digital twins and simulations and how we use that to not need to. So if I'm going to put something onto a rocket, I'm going to put it onto an automobile, digital twinning, right? And getting to that and how that is part of DevOps and this DevSecOps mentality. All of these things are part of a bigger puzzle. Be a really interesting conversation to understand how you guys have been leveraging that in some of these different fields.
There you have it. Maybe our next roundtable.
There you go.
Guys, that's actually a great segue because we're about out of time and we have just a few minutes left. First of all, I want to thank Tricentis for sponsoring DevOps Unbound in general, this roundtable in particular. You know, we do a lot of sponsored activities here, obviously across DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Container Journal, TechStrong. Tricentis is one of the better sponsors to work with. I want to also call out the Perforce folks. And when I say that, it's not that I'm endorsing their products per se or anything like that, or IBM's or anyone. Just as a sponsor, they allow us, it's okay to have other vendors on here. It's okay we get to set the agenda, right? It's not driven, right? Otherwise, we'd be talking about testing all the time or something, and we don't. Right? We talk about great topics. So many thanks to Tricentis. I want to thank Perforce, IBM, Rosalind, and Steve, and MITRE to allow us to have Trace and Steve and Rosalind on with us. What a great conversation this is, right? Most of all, I want to thank all of you out there for joining in, whether you're watching this live, and I know a lot of you are, but a lot of you also watch this on demand, and maybe you didn't get a chance to ask a question or whatever, and I apologize. We're working on ways you can still ask questions after the fact, kind of back to the future, but we'll hopefully keep working on it. But thank you very much for watching it, because without you guys watching it, it's just the six of us. Well, we might sit and talk among ourselves anyway.
Yeah.
We don't really need them, but it does make it more interesting to have a live audience. And thank you so much. I want to thank Mitchell for always kind of, riding herd with me on these things and seeing them through. And our executive producers, Jody and Chantel, who kind of herd the cats here to make this possible. But that's it for this month's DevOps Unbound Live Roundtable. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a recorded, not live panel, which will, as usual, be a fantastic discussion, I'm sure. But until then, this is Alan Schimmel for TechStrong, thanking all of you for your participation. Thank you, everyone.
Have an awesome day.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.